time. So this was the cover I wanted to start with because it was a drawing created in 1872. It's not an actual aerial photography or drawing from a balloon. It's an imagined image with the exaggerated roadways. This is the actual piece created in 1872 by C.N. Dry. He did this for several other. Can you hear me okay? I'm speaking.
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear you, but I don't think it's, there we go.
All right. Everybody should be seeing the full-size C.N. Dry overhead view from 1872.
Yes.
This was raw as it existed at that time, imagined from a point in the sky. You can see the big building in the middle where the roads all end is the Capitol. Our Capitol was built in 1840. Raleigh itself was laid out in the early 1790s. It's a city that was intended to be here for no other reason than that the legislature decided it would be here. In the picture, back over this excerpt again, it's just to bring it down to a little more manageable size. You can see the Capitol with the four wings. From the sky, it's shaped like a plus sign. And overhead, that is the beginnings of the Oakwood neighborhood. The piece of land with two bodies of water is Oakwood Cemetery. And this image has the beginnings of our synagogue as well. Our beginnings of Jewish life in Raleigh started with Oakwood Synagogue, Oakwood Cemetery rather. So just in case any of us are new, I also wanted to show this, this map. It's a little less welcoming. This is a current Wake County property map. The two purple areas should be ignored. They're floodplains. They have nothing to do with the tour, but they're part of the map I was able to grab. The plus sign in the middle is the Capitol from overhead. What I wanted to make clear for anyone who doesn't get to go downtown very much, because plenty of people don't, is that Raleigh was laid out 1,000 acres with a grid that was planned to have the Capitol in the middle and 4 public areas on 4 blocks surrounding the Capitol. And if you're ever lost looking at an overhead photo or a map and don't know kind of how to get your bearings, if you can find the plus sign building, the Capitol, and those 2 squares, they have never had anything built on them. They are the public squares that still exist today. So the skyline can change, but the map will always be understandable if you can find where those 2 parks are and the Capitol in the middle. What we're going to be looking at today are 3 locations outlined in red. The previous location for Beth Meyer Synagogue was in the Cameron Park neighborhood. After Beth Meyer left and sold the building, it became an office building, and that's pretty much how it looks today. Before that, well, we were there from 1950 to 1983. And from the early 20s until 1950, we were in the Oakwood neighborhood. And before that, before there were any synagogues in Raleigh, the oldest Jewish institution in Raleigh is a cemetery, but possibly not the one you know about. There is a small section of Oakwood Cemetery, small enough that I really couldn't put it on the map very well, but it would be roughly where the right-hand corner of that cemetery picture would be. And that's where we're going to start. Over on the right, in the bigger cemetery, many people will know. This is probably the main place Jews meet downtown for an organized reason. It's the Raleigh Hebrew Cemetery, and this is an overhead view looking from State Street, not a traditional way to look at a map. We are over St. Augustine's, kind of facing west. And if we go further up over the sky, over the cemetery and the Oakwood Cemetery next to it, I've got this sort of a view with the Hebrew Cemetery outlined in the oval. And where the original Hebrew section of Oakwood Cemetery is, whoops, sorry, going backwards, is right there. That rectangle on the upper left is the original Hebrew section. Coming down a little closer, it's got the Confederate Cemetery just to the west. And this is how it looks from the street. just over the fence. It's got about 30, 35 graves. It was restored a few years ago to put that little low fence around it. I don't know if you can see the low stones with the chain in between them, but the cemetery committee restored it very nicely, and it can be seen. Oakwood Cemetery is open for people to walk around and see, and I think it's definitely worth seeing. A little background about Oakwood Cemetery, about our part of the Jewish communal part of Oakwood Cemetery. The first to be buried was an immigrant who died in 1869. It was a big deal for the Jews to get a cemetery started. There's an expression that when Jews begin living in an area, first you get the cemetery, then you get the school, then you get the synagogue. The priority is to get a consecrated piece of land for burying Jews first. Michael Grossman is the first of the 10 names on the charter, and he was as good as a rabbi as we could have. He was a tailor, but very well trained, and he and his wife served as hosts of the congregation in their home. Okay. These are pictures from 4 years ago. They were taken by the News and Observer photographer. Barbara Friedman from Beth Or Synagogue led a tour. In the left picture, she's indicating the gravestone of Regina Grossman, who was Michael Grossman's wife, and he was the almost rabbi, she was the almost Rebbitzin. The picture on the right, I don't know if you can see, unfortunately, my view of the screen has everybody's faces over it, but there's just a bit of a cross headstone, which when I gave a presentation to the Hebrew High kids last year, they were surprised. But realistically, this is a small section in a larger non-Jewish synagogue. So you'll have stones you wouldn't have in a Jewish cemetery. I wanted to include this page of this column from the 1909 Raleigh City Directory, which listed all the cemeteries that were in town at this point. If you look halfway down the first section, it says Hebrew Cemetery in Oakwood. Now, what you might also notice is that there's 2 cemeteries down below everybody else, segregated off as colored. This was Raleigh of its time. Raleigh was a segregated town. And just above Hebrew Cemetery and that listing is Confederate Cemetery. On paper, it's listed separately, but realistically, there's no distinction. When you're there in person, everything blends in together except for that little fence around the Hebrew Cemetery. The Confederate graves are in Oakwood Cemetery because the federal government required they all be moved out of the National Cemetery. Confederate soldier graves were not supposed to be there, and so they were moved after they had been buried. While the predecessor to Beth Meyer Synagogue, the name we had was House of Jacob. Before that, there was the only game in town, which was an Orthodox group called either the Raleigh Hebrew Congregation or the Raleigh Orthodox Hebrew Congregation. Again, Michael and Regina Grossman were, their homes served as the location for teaching the children and for holding services. And later they moved to office space above a store. Fayetteville Street was where the 2- and 3-story retail section was, and space above retail was traditionally for offices and organizations like this. And the congregation was able to have a Torah and an Ark. This is the only table in the tour, but I wanted to show it to you because the years from about 1880 to 1920 were pretty critical in terms of Raleigh's growth and the growth of Jews in Raleigh. If you'll notice, the growth rate between 1880 and 1900 was only about 7%. We're talking about growth of Raleigh population, not just the Jewish population. Before that, Raleigh had grown by over a third in 1880 and 1890. And in the 1890s, there was a financial setback, and people left Raleigh, including Jews, and people did come, so it grew, but it was not a a thriving time. It was also bad for the Jews in that Michael Grossman died in 1891. So it was relatively low activity among the Jewish population at that time. If you look at around 1920, when we had 24,000 people, between 1910 and 1920, well, the growth rate was considerable. And my way of looking at it is that if you ever were curious as to how big a town had to be to have Jews wanting to split between the traditional and the liberal, that's the time frame. That's when you got to about 20,000, there were apparently enough Jews for the Jews to want to stop being together and split off between Orthodox and Reform. It had a hard time trying to educate the children together, and it was time to part ways. 1912 was also the time that the synagogues, well, the cemetery property that we know today, that was formed and opened in 1912, that began. So it was a pretty critical time. Now, the House of Jacob was the name that was chosen for the Orthodox synagogue that eventually became our synagogue. It met above stores on Fayetteville Street until about 1923. In 1923, we began meeting in a two-story building at 7 Southeast Street. That is just south of Newburgh, and it was a two-purpose building. The rabbi and family lived downstairs, and the congregation met upstairs. Really three purposes, because in the backyard, that's where they slaughtered the chickens. The column on the right is from the 1927 Raleigh City Directory. One of the materials I wanted to point out, as long as people are at home with their computers, is city directories are available for almost every year. And if you haven't ever explored them, anyone with an interest in history could enjoy it. They list every head of household twice. Once in alphabetical listings, like you would with a phone book, only people are listed with their occupation. And they're listed a second time by their street address. So you can see here this little section of East Street starting at Newbern Avenue. Number 7 was Reverend Isidore Prince, which is what our rabbi was called at that point. And 7.5 was House of Jacob. It was upstairs from the rabbi's family. You might also notice that number 9, Fanny S. Evans, has a little C next to her name, and that's to indicate colored. This was a segregated city, and the city directory listed everybody by race. Linking this back to the 1872 map, 50 years later, that was the corner where our first synagogue freestanding building was built. And this picture, which we saw a little bit before, this is probably the best known historical photo from Beth Meyer's history. That's the entire Sunday school at the time, the rabbi, the teachers, and all the kids. Our synagogue typically had between 20 and 25 families in those early decades. And this is a picture from the early 20s. You can see the Capitol with different pads through it than it has today. And down Newbern was our location. This is an example. This is a picture from December of 1950. And the synagogue building was still there. We were about to move over to the Cameron Park area. I do want to mention that if you walk around this area, the major feature of the neighborhood was not built yet. That's the federal building. They had torn down. This was Hugh Morrison High School and then junior high school. And the block it was on and the block of houses on Newburgh were all torn down for the federal building. Now, what was on our site before our synagogue, right? This is a page from a Sanborn map. Sanborn maps are terrific resources for historians. They were made for insurance companies. They documented every single dwelling and outbuilding that a city could have. They are available for every year. The ones from 1909 and 1914 are online through UNC in Chapel Hill. And I'm going to enlarge this on the corner there. What you can see here from the 1909 Sanborn map was the property on the corner was Cox Memorial Methodist Episcopal Church, which was the largest denomination of African-American churches. It indicates that it was heated by stove and had oil lamps. So in 1909, that was not a progressive building and potentially something of an insurance risk. In 1914, the property was listed as abandoned. Now, when I walked around, this whole corner, all those 5 buildings are now a blacktop parking lot. When I walked around the property with David Glass last year, I really hadn't appreciated how small the property is. When you think about basically half of that church property, because the left-hand side was a billboard, right side was both as big enough to have an apartment with 2 bedrooms on the first floor and a synagogue building with a tiny kitchen on the second floor, and in the back space for slaughtering chickens the kosher way. It's not a very big space. If you do go, historic Oakwood are all the blocks shown in brown. Oakwood Cemetery, where we have our original Hebrew section, is shown in green. And it's really kind of nice to see that the other 3 corners from where our building would have been are still there. Jewish families who belong to the synagogue tended to live on the lower, the southern half of the Oakwood neighborhood. And a lot of Oakwood has been restored and is wonderful to see. And frankly, we came close to losing it. In the late 60s, early 70s, there was a plan to blast a highway through. And I've circled in black there where our synagogue building was. There's another map that shows there's an off-ramp from the highway going through that property. But Oakwood would have been considerably different with development and appropriate for being adjacent to a highway. It's kind of remarkable that the neighbors were able to push it back. In terms of Beth Meyer Synagogue, in the last years before we moved, the rabbi at the time, Rabbi Schwartz, convinced the congregation to join the conservative movement and give up the Orthodox label. And similar to the way the name had been chosen, House of Jacob, which was chosen in a lottery, the name Beth Meyer was chosen in an auction. And Beth Meyer Dworsky who was honored. He had died in 1943, and his descendants contributed the highest bid to rename the synagogue in his memory. But Oakwood was declining in those days, and we didn't have enough space. So moving over to the Cameron Park neighborhood was a smart idea. You can see it on the upper left there with the circle around it. This is the groundbreaking. That was Rabbi Schwartz again. And the property was purchased in 48. The groundbreaking was in 49. This is how the building looks pretty much today. This is the only building in Raleigh that was built as a synagogue and repurposed that is still standing. So it's really the only current former synagogue in Raleigh. When our synagogue was there, the large bay window to the right of the front door, it did not have windows on all 3 walls. The middle wall was the back of the sanctuary, and there was a brick relief piece, and we did not have stained glass windows when it was first built. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute, but if you're interested in walking around this neighborhood, it's not a neighborhood like Oakwood in that there were plenty of members living there. As a conservative synagogue, the members were able to drive to, and they were more dispersed throughout the city. This is a neighborhood of schools. St. Mary's has Broughton just to the north, and Wiley and St. Mary's School just to the south. This is a close-up view of the property as it is now. It is the corner of West Johnson Street and St. Mary Street. point of fact, St. Mary's is really a much more prominent road than West Johnson Street in the layout of Raleigh. But I think you can understand why a synagogue would want to have an address on West Johnson Street rather than St. Mary's Street. The subsequent properties have used the St. Mary's side as the address. Wanted to show you the Wake County real estate site. I don't know if you've ever looked. Wake County records are online, and if you look over on the left, 3 back, it says House of Jacob, because in 1948, when we bought it, that was the name. If you look 4 back, the name Jean B. Laborwit, I'm told there was some concern that the neighbors might object if they knew a synagogue was buying the property. So Jean B. Laborwit would be the sort of the shell owner of the property. And you can see in the right column, they were, well, actually you can't necessarily, if you have like my screen, it was the same day the purchase was made by Jean Laborwit. It was then purchased by House of Jacob. It was felt that the Laborwit name didn't stand out as a Jewish name as much as some other names might. We have interior shots from Beth Meyer in this building. I'm grateful for them. These came from Lisa Botvinnik, and I don't mean to make fun of any of the pictures. The one on the left, I think it caught some glare from the flash. Well, that's not actually a room on fire. And frankly, nobody looks good in a still, a candid picture of people dancing. So that was a teen dance in '67 and a fundraiser, a fancy dinner in 1950. And this is the more prominent space I want folks to see. This is the sanctuary. You may recognize certain pieces of it because they were relocated to our chapel. The ark, the eternal light, the stained glass windows, the memorial plaques were put in the sanctuary. The tall candelabra are in the chapel, along with the pews, and even the sconces on the right side. The stained glass windows were a later addition. When the building first opened, this is just before it was completed, you can see the bay window projection, the back of the very front of the sanctuary. There were no stained glass windows yet, and you can maybe see the relief brick of the menorah. That would have been the back wall behind the ark. This is how it looked when the ark and everything else had been taken to our current building. This is the day of the Torah trek, when the Torahs were marched under a canopy from Cameron Park all the way up to Newton Road. We did a program on this a few years ago, the Adult Dead Brunch, and there were a lot of good memories shared. But you can see here, the windows were replaced with the plain glass for the next occupants, and the ark was also was moved before. Well, everything's out of the room now. This is how the stained glass windows look now for anyone who isn't familiar with the chapel. The same artist was recruited to make 3 additional windows to go in a larger space around the 2 windows that had not previously been next to each other. This is the way the West Johnson Street building looks now. If plans go forward, it's going to have the current owners are going to tear down the lower portion to the left of the front door and build a larger addition. This will be office space. This is a shot of the way it'll probably look after construction. I'm very glad that they're leaving the bay window as it is. We'll always be able to point out where our congregation met in these years, and the form follows function idea of the front of the sanctuary just as it is. I was in this building as an office building, and before I knew it had been House of Beth Meyer Synagogue, and there is no sign left inside that it ever had been a synagogue. If you walk around the neighborhood, there are plenty of places where the old, smaller structures have been torn down, and there are new 3, 4, 5-story apartments being built. I just wanted to make sure people were aware that it used to be a little lower rise. This building was a funeral home across St. Mary's Street from Beth Meyer. And there was a setback, there was a lawn, there were trees. It's getting a little more urban in that section now. And since we have a couple of shots I wanted to show of what was going on with Beth Orr, this was the Beth Orr building built on Hillsborough Street in 1920. They kind of skipped the middle stage between their 1920s life and their North Raleigh life. And they used the same synagogue structure all that time. It was on Hillsborough Street until early 1991. They had sold it to a church and it kind of fell into disrepair. The stories I've heard from Beth Orr people are that there were several years of overlap between Beth Orr meeting in that building and the char grill being in operation. And it made fasting on Yom Kippur kind of unpleasant when the char grill smells were coming in the windows. And this is the last slide for tonight. This is a map that the synagogue board constructed in 1980 to show where all the members lived. And as you can see, we were spreading north. The Jewish Star on Newton Road was the proposed location of the next synagogue. And we were all over Raleigh at that point. So and definitely heading north. Most of the Jewish population was heading north, which is why Beth Meyer built off of Creedmoor Road and Shays built on Falls of Neuse. And that's what I have for you this evening. And I'm happy to hand it back to Julia to pass along questions if they've come in or if they're going to come in now.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions? I haven't seen any questions in the chat, although people were very surprised at the images and thought it was really fascinating. But does anyone want to type in or share questions they have?
It's okay if there's no questions.
I think there are. I think people are getting their stuff ready.
Right, trying to find my unmute button. Go.
So when did Chabad move into the Raleigh area? Is that anything?
I honestly don't know. Sharay was built originally as an Orthodox synagogue without Chabad involvement. I know that, but I don't honestly know when Chabad began affiliating with them.
Penny Herman was the first Chabad rabbi. Before that, there were others. And he was there for what, 35 years, something like that? 25 years, 30 years? I forget exactly how much. Sometime in the relatively early 80s, early to mid 80s.
Thank you, Mike.
I was in the building on West Johnson Street a few years after it was turned into an office building. And I was able to find some evidences of it having been a synagogue, although I suspect those evidences are gone now. I forget what they were, but it was possible to determine this is where the sanctuary was. And I don't know whether I'd ever been in it when it was a synagogue.
I was a volunteer in the Mary Noe Watson mural campaign, and they were giving out materials there. And so that's how I happened to be in the building. But yeah, nothing synagogue-like jumped out at me when I was in it. I was surprised to find out later that's where it was. If you can ever remember what you saw that suggested synagogue, I'd be curious to hear it.
Well, it was, I mean, there was something, the structure of the sanctuary there was still bits of the structure, the shape of the sanctuary, but I think I had to have somebody tell me this is where the ark was. But it was somebody who was working in that building at the time.
Okay.
And I know that I saw the Beth Orr building on Hillsborough Street before it was torn down, but I don't remember it very well. I remember it being torn down and being a little shocked that they did that and built an office building there instead.
Yeah, it was empty for about 4 years, and then they built a 3-story building that was innovative for its time, because people in the early 90s, you didn't see too many apartments being built over stores, but they have 3 storefronts on the first floor and apartments above that.
I don't remember any stores in there at the beginning.
Not the original building. It was torn down in 91, and in 95 they built the current
When
building.
they put up the replacement building, the only thing I remember there was David Price's office. That's how I remember seeing it, because I knew it was his office.
Gotcha.
Do you know if there were any like cultural or like holiday things that Beth Meyer did then that are on record, like a Hanukkah party or something like that, that the city recognized?
Yes and no. There's an archive at the News and Observer, and I did a search at one point for House of Jacob, and there were a lot of hits, over 50 hits. And my plan at some point was to sign up for the free trial and copy all the articles I could get that had any reference to House of Jacob in them. And, but right now, I have not taken that step. The resources I've used so far have been ones that were completely free. The UNC Chapel Hill has a lot of material available to people just around North Carolina. You don't have to be affiliated with the university at all. There are more resources when libraries are open that one can go check out. But because I can't have access, to any of those right now, the News and Observer is looking more appealing all the time.
Hey, Harlan, it's Roger. I'm just curious because you mentioned restricted neighborhoods. At what point in time did they sort of eliminate restricted neighborhoods? And how long after that before you could use a Jewish name to buy property?
That's, I don't know. Well, second question first. I don't know that they couldn't have bought the synagogue property for the synagogue. It was just hedging their bets more than anything else. I've also wondered why since they could have had the address 800 West Johnson Street rather than 806. It seems kind of self-effacing to choose a number that wasn't terribly prominent. I think they were basically trying to keep their heads a little low. But that's just my perception from the evidence I've seen, not from anything I've seen had presented by point of fact. I do know if you, I'm not sure when the rules would have been relaxed about segregation. I wonder if I can just scan up quickly to the second, whoops, too far. I think it wants to go to the beginning. Okay, back down here. I don't know if you saw reading up from along the, I didn't want to do this. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Yes.
Negro tenements is what the Sanborn map indicated there, and it's kind of astonishing, but that was what they did. That's how they were listing for insurance purposes. I'm not sure what that would classify as redlining, but I do know there's the Poe House, which is, I believe, on South Wilmington Street, very near, well, a block over from the Memorial Hall in that area. There's a McDonald's on one block south of it. The Pope family was prominent, and that was as close into central Raleigh as they could build that house under the rules of the time for where a black home could be. It's owned by the city of Raleigh, and it's a museum that's open a couple of times a month, and when there's no pandemic, and it's possessions of the family are preserved there.
Where is that?
The Poe House.
Yeah.
Pope House. It's I can find you the information, but from what I read about it, it was built intentionally as close in as he could get. They would not have been allowed to build on the other side of South Wilmington Street as a black family.
Okay.
And if you look through the city directory, through points that are further south and east of this corner, the names that are listed as homeowners, they all have parentheses C after the homeowner name. I guess they were residents, not homeowners, because they could have been renters also.
Wow.
Next question.
Oh, Harlan?
Hey, Sid.
Yeah, quick question. I didn't remember. When we bought the property in 1949, was there any, I don't remember, was that raw land or was there something on that building? Or did we buy a raw lot and then build that synagogue?
From the looks of the groundbreaking, from what I've seen, that would have been, I think it was open land.
Open land. Yeah, it's funny because I remember, later, I moved to Raleigh in 81. So I have vague memories of going to, the synagogue occasionally, living out near the current synagogue, driving downtown. So that is, yeah, and you're right with this picture, this would seem to indicate it was just open land back in 1949.
That doesn't mean there might have been something there before that didn't have a long life, because the Cameron Park neighborhood was developed in the teens and 20s. And so relatively long time for a lot to stay empty. But I don't believe the synagogue tore something down to build the building that was built there in 1950.
Yeah. Do you have any idea of how the synagogue sort of decided on that property, or how they, came upon it or anything?
I don't know in terms of the real estate choosing process. I do know that it was somewhat controversial because there were still people living in Oakwood who walked to shul, and they had to either decide to drive to shul. There were at least two members, I've been told, who kept walking, along all the way. I can show you the map again, but it would have been, from this part of Oakwood up to Cameron Park.
And by the way, has anybody been able to identify some of the people here in the groundbreaking other than the rabbi? I'm wondering if any of those people in the picture are related to, people today, the Horowitzes or some of the others.
There's no one I know by name, but I do know Burton. That's what on my list of things to ask Burton about, because Burton told me that, Burton donated the picture and then asked if he could have a copy for a friend in Greensboro whose father is in the picture. And I was happy to do that. We also, the archives also has the actual clipping with a caption that appeared in the News and Observer, but the picture is kind of, it's not as easy to see as this one.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I was thinking too, and you said David, you walked around that property. David's another one that might know who some of these people are. Is it David?
They're both such good resources. In fact, if I before we end, I want to make sure I mention that several people I wanted to thank. They may or may not be on the call, but Risa Botvinnik, Barbara Friedman, David Glass, Burton Horowitz, and Charlotte Litwack are all people who have helped me, helped the archives, and helped this presentation with their information they've given me and the donations they've made to the archives.
Well, thank you for all that you're doing as far as pulling together an archives. I mean, it's quite a history.
Yeah, thank you
It
so
is.
much.
Thank you very much.
I also just
You're quite
wanted to
welcome.
mention that
Thank
this
you.
was recorded,
Yeah.
and the synagogue is going to maybe edit it a little so it doesn't have the technical difficulties at the beginning. But if you email the office, you can get a private YouTube link to rewatch this in the future if you want to look back.
I want to make one comment about the location. I don't know what went into the decisions, but I know that even though Cameron Park had been developed before World War II, Cameron Village, the shopping center, and a lot of stuff around it happened around the same time that Beth Meyer was built there in 1949.
Yeah.
So there obviously was a development going on in that part of town.
There was.
Made sense to go there, to be part of that. You know, the shopping center.
But it doesn't quite explain how those properties along St. Mary's were undeveloped all that time. It's not a question I thought about before, but compared to the with the Sanborn map giving us the history behind the Southeast Street property, it would be interesting to see if the Sanborn maps went this far and had any previous information.
And that is Broughton High School right there, right? That's been there a long time.
The high school's been there since the 20s.
Yeah.
Didn't have the parking lots in the front yard at that time. It was a great picturesque lawn. And this is
No, St. Mary's.
Broughton High School up.
No, where is
Broughton High School's up here.
over
St.
here?
Mary's is
Yeah.
down here.
Clark, yeah.
Oh, there's Smallwood. I know somebody who lives there.
For me?
I dated her.
Julia?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes. Yeah, so
Really?
if that's it, you can always send me or Harlan questions you have afterwards, and we can keep the conversation going. But thank you all for coming.
Thank you. My class.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
That
Bye-bye.
was good.
Bye-bye.
See you next time.
Bye.
Radio.
I didn't
Good night, everyone.
What do you do?
Turn it back on.
You panicked.